Do you get to work in your area of strength every day at work? Do you even know what your strengths are, or are you a bit blind to them? In today's episode of the award-winning Happier at Work podcast, which is the podcast for people first leaders, all about career and culture topics, my guest is Marijke Kershaw, and she's sharing insights about strengths, about what they are, and it might surprise you because it's not what we necessarily have always been taught that strengths are. We also talk about weaknesses or allowable weaknesses. And we talk about succession planning and high performance individuals and how to identify who those high performers are, which typically is done in a very subjective way. But this is a way to identify in a more objective and scientific and data driven way. So I really hope you enjoy today's episode. Don't forget to drop a comment below if you have any questions, if you have any comments, if you want to let me know what you're going to do differently as a result of watching today's episode. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Marijke, you're so welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm so pleased to have you as my guest today. Do you want to let listeners know a little bit about you, your background, and how you got into doing what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you. So a little bit about me and my background. So I currently work for a company called Mercer Talent Enterprise. And but the journey to get there has been a very, very long one. So I started out actually working in the FMCG industry. And I was working for a company you may know called Heinz, selling
Yes.
tomato ketchup. Yes, so I used to work as a trade category manager, category development controller, doing a lot of work with data. For those that live in the UK, if there was a end of tomato ketchup in a Sainsbury's or in a Tesco, then I would have been the one that decided that that should be there. I was also the one that would decide what the promotional uplifts or understand what the promotional uplifts were and the impact of it. I had a bit of an epiphany actually through going on a leadership development program that is not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I went on quite a journey of discovery to work out what does success mean for me? What does success look like for me? And I recognized that it came down to people. And so I did a coaching diploma and and then moved into facilitation and learning as well. And so for the last 10 years, I've worked as a facilitator and coach. I did 8 years of freelance and then fell in love with the organization that I'm working with now because of their culture and decided to go back and work in an organization again. And I've been with Mercer Talent Enterprise for the last 3 years, really focusing on development programs for them and also looking at succession and high potential and how people and understanding how people use their strengths in the workplace as well. So that's sort of what we focus on within the HR space. Along that journey, I also did some extra study and have been really specializing in organizational psychology. And that's my background. Originally from New Zealand, based in Dubai, mum of two gorgeous children. So that's me.
I love it. And Marijke, you probably didn't know this about me, but that's a very similar background to me. But I always worked on agency side in FMCG, Heinz being one of my clients on more than
Ah,
one occasion in multiple parts of the world. So yeah, that's my own background
amazing.
and not a dissimilar kind of epiphany. Is this really what I want to be doing? Went on to do a master's in organizational behavior, which I couldn't do organizational psychology because I didn't have the psychology background. Um, but it's exactly the same master's degree, and I absolutely loved it. And it was like the data and the people side of stuff. So I think we're going to have a really, really interesting conversation today. If nothing but that entire transition from going from taking strengths that you already have but weren't necessarily utilizing them in the way that you wanted, and applying them into a different situation. So maybe talk to us a little bit more about that journey. I'd love to uncover a little bit more about that whole decision process and what that epiphany was, and maybe we can talk a little bit more then about strengths.
Yeah, absolutely. So what there was a few things that led to this epiphany. The first was actually doing some psychometrics. So I did the Discovery Insights profile, which showed that I was very high on the people aspects of work. And then it does a showing of the skills that you use at work, and they were all my lowest strengths were the skills that I was using the most at work. So that was interesting for me. And I also looked around, and I was very successful. And so I was promoted to being a category development controller, but I would look around and I would see some of my colleagues who loved data, and just the energy and the joy and the interest that they had in it. And I had this realization that I'm only ever going to be average or mediocre in this area of work, and that I was coming home from work absolutely exhausted every single day. And that actually led to, I'm not sure if I got to the point of burnout, but just feeling grey inside.
Yeah.
And getting no joy from the work that I was doing. And part of the leadership development program that I went on around the same time talked about success, and this concept of success means different things to different people, and that if you're not in the role that you feel is best for you, then you're taking up that role for someone who would potentially really love it.
Yeah.
So this idea of having the courage to actually explore what it is that you really love doing, and trying to understand that so that you can job craft or move your career in that direction, because that will ultimately mean that you can be at your best in that role, that you can come to work and sort of thrive within what you were doing. And that concept really stuck with me. And so I sort of went down just started exploring in that area, and sort of, mind mapping to find out what are the things that I really love in life, and what excites me and engages me, and it always came back to people.
In what sense? Like, is it a particular area when it comes to people?
It is. I love the relationship with people, so I love the relationship building and helping people, but it's also a fascination with how this idea of growth and potential, and the idea of people reaching that potential as well, and raising conscious awareness of who they are, and connecting back in with what makes them unique, and reconnecting or helping people reconnect with that, the core of who they are, and using that as that strength, and gaining confidence from knowing that about themselves through raising that awareness. I learned that through going on a coaching course. And so I got sent on as part of this leadership development program as well, I got sent on a one-day course to be a more effective line manager. and the that concept of everyone is 100% whole, and it is about removing the barriers for them to be able to reach their potential. And I realized that is what really lit my fires when working with and thinking about people.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I feel like I've sort of had not a dissimilar journey in that when I was working in an area where it was like, okay, I'm doing an okay job, but I'm the kind of person, if I'm doing a job, I want to do a really excellent job because those are the kind of standards that I strive for. And I wasn't in a position where I could really work fully to all of the strengths that I'd built up over my career and my natural abilities and doing this role. And I just got to a stage where I was like, I don't want to do it anymore. And I went on and I did coaching qualification as well. And then I did my master's. And when I was doing the master's, it was everything coming together. It was the data and the people side of things and understanding that. And, you know, I've done several bits of research over the years around potential and understanding people's potential. I did a not so scientific poll on LinkedIn a few years ago, but I was so surprised even for myself that it was in the 80%, something 80%, 80 something percent, like maybe 85, 87% of people said that they didn't feel like they were reaching their full potential at work. And I suppose that's why I went on and I created this podcast to talk about these kinds of things that I think we really, really need to talk about at work. You know, if you're working to your strengths, you are much happier at work. And people stay in those situations, I think, for a long time as well, not wanting to change, being afraid. Like there's so many justifiable reasons for people to stay in the situation that they're in. And I suppose maybe both of us have that same message that it's not, you know, there are other options. There are other options for you out there if you choose to open your mind a little bit and understand a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I was to give anyone advice, it would be to focus on and really understanding your strengths. And strengths, as we were talking about before, they're not things that you are good at, right? That it's not about competence. You can be very good at an area that brings you no joy whatsoever. And so when we talk about strengths, it's this idea of, well, or thinking about is what makes you stronger.
Yes.
And in Mercer Talent Enterprise, we always talk about the 3 E's. So we talk about things being your signature strengths. So the things that are really unique to you. And these are things that energize you, things that are essential to who you are as a person and are actually effortless for you to do. And because these strengths are effortless for you, there's sometimes you don't even realize they're a strength. It's about having that awareness of, okay, what is just something I can do that energizes me, that feels like it has to be essential to who I am as a person. And then once you've recognized that and understand it, it's like, well, how do I then bring that into my everyday work? And focus on those strengths rather than trying to, we always talk also about allowable weaknesses. So I think in the workplace, we're very clear on what our weaknesses are, and we'll put things in place to fix our weaknesses. But I want to turn that on its head and say, you also need to think about your strengths and build development plans on those areas of strengths that you've got as well.
Yeah.
Because that's the pathway to excellence. If you just focus on weaknesses and trying to build those up to where your natural strengths may be, then you've got, your average across the board. If you look at it of going, okay, so that's an allowable weakness. That's not something I'm particularly good at, but there's other people in my team who are, so I can use their strengths as well and use my team's strengths. And I'm going to focus on areas such as, being the person who understands relationships and builds relationships. Empathy is a big skill of mine. I'm going to learn more about empathy and how I can utilize this empathy in the workplace. That then becomes your signature difference within the workplace, but also that real strength and an area of excellence. And so it's building competence in an area that you're naturally inclined towards.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Already.
There's so much that I want to reflect back on in that. And I know before we started talking, we talked about this concept that, like, I read something recently that talked about strengths not as something, exactly as you said, something necessarily that you're good at. It's not just about that, it's about something that makes you feel strong. So, and also this idea that sometimes we don't know what our strengths are because it comes so easily and naturally to us that we don't even realize. Kind of a random example that comes to my mind when I think about strengths is, if you've ever done an escape room. I love doing escape rooms, and I did one with my friends one time, and I was like, oh, well, that thing, it connects to that thing over there. And my friend was like, how did you do that? I said, what did you mean? Like, was that not like completely obvious that those two things were connected? So clearly that's something that is a strength of mine that I take for granted, that I didn't know that other people don't have that strength. I know it's kind of a random example, but these kinds of things happen all the time. And I think if you just start noticing those things, like what are people coming to you for, to ask you questions about, what do people say, oh my God, how did you do that so quickly or so easily or so naturally or whatever it might be? I think it's so it's so important to notice those kinds of things. And I suppose the next step is, how do we make that transition once we understand a little bit more about what are our strengths? And maybe we'll come on to like uncovering what those are. But how do you then, once you uncover what those strengths are, how do you make the transition into, okay, I want to start using these strengths more in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. And that's the challenge, right? It's the recognition that, and this is what happened, in hindsight, it's an amazing thing because I only realized this looking
2020
back.
vision, hindsight,
I
yeah.
know. But looking back, there was that realization that actually I have these, that I'm not utilizing my strengths in the work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
And going on that journey to find the strengths, and then actually, well, how do I put that in practice,
Yeah.
and how do I job craft, and the so and that's it. So it came down to, for me, whilst I was at Heinz and I hadn't built up the experience or the courage actually also to do a career change, I started job crafting,
Yeah.
role crafting, to say, well, I know that I have these areas that I'm really interested in, around developing people and facilitation. And so any training course that I went on, I would go up and I'd talk to the person who was at the front of the room and be like, how did you get here? What did you
Yes.
do?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do I get where you are? Because I know that this is going to be utilizing my strengths and what I'm really interested in, what I get excited about. And then I started creating training courses for Heinz on areas that I was interested in as well. And once I got my coaching qualification, I then started coaching people in Heinz, so women who were rejoining back after maternity leave, and new graduates coming into the organization that seemed to be struggling a bit, and doing that on top of my my day job as
Yeah.
well, to build up that confidence and that experience to then do the career change, which I liken to moving a massive tanker ship. So it's not going to happen quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not that agile. It's kind of like,
No,
okay, there's
really not.
slow moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of patience there as well in that respect. But it is one of the best decisions, and best things that I've ever actually done from a career perspective, is recognizing that I wasn't in the right place, knowing and working out what my strengths are, and then moving them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd love to pick up on this, something that you shared a little, not too long ago, about weaknesses and allowable weaknesses, because both of us are probably from that era where early career, it was all about focusing on your weaknesses and overcoming your weaknesses. And I suppose from my perspective and from the research that I've done and from my Happier at Work framework, which one of those core elements is focusing on strengths, it's so positive to see that we've kind of moved away from the whole, oh, you need to overcome your weaknesses. And I did read an analogy not too long ago about, so if I think the analogy was about running. And so if you are going against someone who is an elite runner and you're just average or you're not that good at it, then you're competing against someone who is really, really good at that. And no matter how many times you try and build on something that you're just not that good at, you're never going to reach that level. Whereas if you find something that you are so at home doing, that you're so naturally good at, and it gives you like those three things that you said, they energize you, it's essential to your being, and it feels effortless to you, and you focus on that and getting, I think the other thing they were talking about was like, if you got even 1% better at doing that, it's much more effective than getting 1% better at doing something that you're only average at. So really focusing on the strengths. But I love also this idea of the allowable weaknesses. And I talk about working with people who have complementary strengths, people who have strengths that you don't have, and you can try, you can find a way to work really, really well together with the acknowledgement that you both bring something unique to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's something I want to add to that, which is a little bit different from weaknesses.
Okay, yeah.
Is blind spots.
Yes.
And so we've got strengths, and when we overuse strengths, then that can be a blind spot where it actually is having a detrimental impact.
Yes.
So part of also knowing what you have, something that is really essential to you as a person, it means that it can sometimes there'll be behaviors that you're engaging in that other people might have an impact with, because you're almost too much
Yes.
in that area.
Yeah.
And as an example, there is, and I'll talk about it a little bit. So we at the Mercer Talent Enterprise, we actually do a psychometric, and we've designed a psychometric that is based on positive psychology, and it is based on strengths. And this is one thing that really attracted me to working with Mercer Talent Enterprises. It was so connected with my values and focusing on strengths and that importance. But one of the strengths that they measure as on part of it is energy. And if you are a 5 in energy, so you've got a signature strength in energy, you will walk into a room and everyone will know about it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
You will be and need to be the center of intention, and everything is dramatic. And for some people, that's too much.
Yeah.
And for some people, they're like, oh, it's just you drain me of energy, especially if someone who's quite introverted.
Yes.
I struggle with your being a 5 in energy. And part of recognizing and understanding your strengths is understanding, well, what is the impact on other people and on situations when I overuse the strength as well. So it's knowing what your allowable weaknesses are, but also knowing your strengths, and then what impact is that strength having?
Yeah, and it will have different impacts on different people. I always like to think of these things as we're on a spectrum. When I think about Myers-Briggs, and again, when I did the master's, it was like, it's not the best tool to use, but I think it's an easy entry point for people to understand a bit more about their personality. So I usually, when I take that test, come out as an introvert, but other introverts think that I'm an extrovert because I'm a bit more social. So to me, when I think of those things, I don't think of it as boxes so much as it's a spectrum. And if someone is looking from their perspective, they're going to view, so someone who's a 1 on the energy is going to view someone who's a 5 on the energy as, I don't want to be around that person because that takes too much of my energy. When I think of overusing strengths, curiosity, I think is one of my values. It's something that I suppose, really passionate about. Something why I do the podcast, because I get to meet people, I get to connect with them, I get to ask them what I perceive to be really interesting questions. But overusing curiosity can potentially turn into nosiness. Then you're like, oh, she wants to know everything. She wants to have her finger in all of the different pies, that kind of thing. So I think it's interesting, that idea of just being aware, having that self-awareness that it's not just about utilizing the strength, but it's about the impact that strength has on those other people around you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back, and so passionate about it, about just raising your self-awareness.
Yes, yeah, totally.
You don't know.
Yeah.
And once you do know, you're like, okay, I'm a 5 on energy. There are some people that I need to dial that energy back, or there might be some situations where I need to consciously think about it. And there's other times where I'm like, this is going to be a great time where I can really tap into my strength and energy as well.
Love it. Talk to me a little bit more about this psychometric tool that you've devised then.
Yeah, so I think it was created around, I'm probably going to get this wrong, probably around 10 years ago. So it's been in the market for 10 years. And 4 years ago, we got the British, went through BPS, British Psychological Society accreditation. And so it's one of 4 tools in the psychometric area that have that level of validity. As well. So that's, for me, that's very exciting, because it's saying, and you brought up Myers-Briggs, and it's an interesting tool based on sort of type. But the validity of it is really low.
Yes, the test retest. So I've taken it multiple times, and I get different results when I take it different times.
And so this is, and going through the BPS process is saying the validity in the test retest is really high and very strong with this assessment. And it is based on the positive psychology, and it is looking at your strengths at work. So it's looking at things like your change, areas of change, people, task, yourself, and it has 36 strengths that are really important to the workplace. And through a 20-minute assessment, you can understand where your strengths are and also where your blind spots are as well. So it will give you a summary of if you're a 5 in this area, this is what could be happening.
Watch out for this.
And then also, what do you have to watch out for? Right. And the same goes with if you're a 1 in the area. And it's not saying 5 is better, 1 is worse, but as you say, it's on a continuum.
It's just different.
So it's different. And it's called the Thriving Index. And it is based on, the way that it's used is saying, well, okay, how do I use, now that I've got that self-awareness of strengths, what next? And having a session or a reflection on, well, how can I then now use these strengths, now that I know about them, in the workplace to be able to perform. And what we do as an organization, our main area is assessments around high potential and succession. And we bring in the Thriving Index and the strengths into looking at high potential, and looking at, well, what does this actually mean in an organization as well? So, it's sort of.
And is it fair to say that you can't, not that you can't do it in isolation, but it's best to do this as part of a team so that you kind of understand each other's strengths and how maybe you complement each other and how you work together? Or it's like, talk to me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think it works well at an individual level.
Okay.
And it works, but it also works well at a team level as well. And being
Yeah.
able to share your results with the team's results and say, well, what does this mean for us? And especially as a team leader, to know where your team's strengths lie
Yeah.
and who you go to and bring into projects because they've got a strength in that area can help with understanding the work dynamics. But I'll give an example because it's also about how your strengths interact with each other and
Yeah.
what that could mean. And I'll
Okay.
give
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
example of myself. Um, so I am high in autonomy. I've got a 5 in autonomy. I'm very good at working by myself and just getting on and getting things done. I'm high in achievement. Um, I really want to achieve. And I'm also high in mastery. So I want
Yeah.
to master and get exceptionally good at whatever I'm doing. Um, and what this can mean from a blind spot perspective is that because I want to achieve, I will take on probably more than I actually have um, time and space to do. Because I'm like, I love this idea of getting things done.
It sounds familiar.
And then I want to do it really well
Yeah.
and have this sort of perfectionist tendency to come in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I have autonomy, so I want to do it and I just
You
think
won't
about
ask
doing
for
it by
help.
myself.
Yeah.
And so this, and it was really interesting seeing how these work together because they're all strengths, great strengths on their own, but when they
Yeah.
combine, it actually means that I can have a natural cycle of getting to a potential place of burnout.
Yeah.
Because I take on too much. I don't think about using my team because of this blind spot with autonomy, and I can just do it myself. Um, and so recognizing that has is a game changer for me
Yeah.
because I recognize when I'm getting into and I'm overusing these amazing strengths that I've got and I'm getting into a bit of a bind and I can stop it before it goes down into the spiral.
Yeah.
Whereas before I would get to the spiral. Um, and I can say, right, actually, I need to reach out and ask people for help here.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's great from an individual perspective. From a team perspective, it's recognizing those in my team that are significantly different from me. So I've got people on my team who are great at. So I'm a 1 when it comes to systematic. So I'm not particularly systematic in what I'll do. Very
Yeah.
flexible. I've got 1 or 2 team members who are a 5 in systematic and no structure, no detail, no planning. And I find that we work really well together.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will come with the ideas, I will be able to interact with the people, and then my colleague will be able to keep me in line and make sure that the systems and the processes and the detail in the back end is in place
Yeah.
so that we can deliver something really effective together. And so it's also noticing their strengths and valuing their strengths as well. That, yeah.
Are there times when strengths might cause conflict? And when I think of it, it's kind of similar to what you were talking about there. So it's like that big picture thinking versus the detail, where there might be a bit of conflict between someone who has all of these big ideas, but doesn't necessarily have the strength to see the steps to implement them. And then you have someone else who's kind of almost trying to rein them in, saying, this is a great idea, but actually that's going to take us 5 years. Let's focus on the next year or something like that. So any strengths that, while complementary, may cause a little bit of conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when there are those big differences, there's always that that room for misunderstanding
Yeah.
and room for that difference is just annoying me and slowing us down rather than
Yeah.
that difference is adding value.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And what I found also with with using the Thriving Index and with understanding the Thriving Index, it becomes less personal. So it's not this person.
It's not an attack on,
Just,
on an individual or their
yeah,
personality. It's like these are the facts and this is how we can move forward.
yeah. It's like,
Mm.
okay, so this person is just extremely systematic.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
And then you've got that level of sort of understanding that it's not personal. It's not a personal attack on me. It's
Yeah.
just who they are.
Yeah.
And then you become more understanding
Mm.
and yeah, have a little bit more tolerance
You're like, ah,
for
that's
the
why they're
small
like
person.
that. And it's not
Yeah.
about me. And yeah. And so the
And they're not
conflict
just
may
trying to
arise
be,
because they're not just trying to be awkward.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're
Oh, they're
just
just
trying to be
trying to be a
difficult, right?
pain. Yeah. Just trying
Yeah.
to be a pain. I'd love to know a little bit more then about using this for, you mentioned about high potential and also succession planning. So I imagine those are quite closely linked, but you want to talk about how you can use that tool for those
Yeah.
purposes, because I know with a lot of my clients, even like the big global clients, we think they have this stuff figured out, but actually it's a real area, let's call it an area of opportunity for them because they don't have this stuff figured out yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've done a lot of a lot of research in the area of high potential and what strengths are really important um, for driving high performance within organizations as well. And so there's been a lot of different analysis that our data scientists have been doing. And we've actually mapped the strengths that are in the Thriving Index against different potentials. So the drive potential, so that ability to be able to really drive ideas and strategies through an organization, or learning potential as well. So how can a person learn on the job and grow within the job as well? So there's strengths that match to these different potential areas that we know drive the business forward. So what we've found is that when we're looking at these areas, so there's drive, there's learning, there's people, there's strategic potential, execution potential, and change potential. These areas here really drive that performance of the business. And then we've been able to map the strengths of people to these areas and created a potential model, which an organization can go through a high potential assessment process. And this is the looking at, so things like the Thriving Index look at that innate potential. And then the innate potential goes into the sort of that potential model, but then it's looking at the demonstrated potential
Ah,
as
okay.
well
Yeah.
through things like role play, case study, interviews, and taking that innate strengths and linking it with saying, well, actually, what is being demonstrated? I'm merging these two data points together to say, well, okay, this is what a high potential looks like in your organization.
Yeah.
And then being able to show what that spread is
Yeah.
and where the development areas are as well. So
Yeah.
the most important thing is then being able to take that data and say, well, what are you going to do with it? Right.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's not just
and
about having it, it's about what action are you taking. Yeah.
yeah, what action are you taking? And so it's the development programs and then the IDPs and individual development plans that come out the back of it as well.
Yeah.
So after they've gone through the high potential assessments, it's really important to then have a session with each of the people that have gone through those assessments and feedback on what their strengths are, feedback on what came out of the demonstrated potential and assessment centres, and then say, well, so what for you?
Yeah.
And how do you want to use this information to drive your career forward and drive your development forward. Looking at it from that 70-20-10 model as well, where 70% of it's on job, 20% social, 10% formal learning. And really when we're doing those IDPs, it's saying, well, what can you do in your day-to-day? And that's when we can go into conversations around role crafting or looking for gaining that experience that's going to help them drive their path within the organization and career.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many more questions I have about all of this stuff. But my first one is whether each of those high potential areas is unique to each individual organization, or are they kind of a bit more generic, like this is what you need to succeed in work in general?
Yeah. So the innate potential, we can map that to the different competencies that an organization has got. But when we look at sort of thinking about what are the strengths that are important in that organization, but we're trying to steer away from that now and saying, well, overall innate potential, these are the strengths that really drive high performance from an innate potential perspective. And then the demonstrated potential is is measured against their competency framework. So what are the behaviors and what are the competencies that you want to see within your organization? And then the assessment centers, so the role plays and the case studies, will assess against those behaviors and try and show those behaviors, and give the candidates and the people going through the assessment center the opportunity to demonstrate those behaviors. And that's where the organizational element comes in.
What I love about this is that it's scientific, because what I often see with my clients is it's very subjective how they decide these things. I've been in those rooms myself where you have a conversation and it's almost like an argument between senior leaders of, no, I think that person, and you compare people to each other, but you compare them on just a very generic basis, as opposed to in these very specific areas that is required to excel at the next level. So this is what I love particularly about that tool, that both from the organization perspective, being able to acknowledge and recognize that, and then from the individual perspective, having that clear path of this is what my next step is. I'm being recognized as someone who is a high potential, because we often talk about what that means, but it's not really, or we often talk about it in more generic terms, but we don't necessarily define, well, what does that actually mean in our organization? Anything else to share on? Sorry, did you want to say something?
Oh my God, I've got so much to share.
Yes.
I'm like, yes. And this is what gets me excited about it, is that it takes something that is inherently subjective and makes it as objective as possible. And it tries to take the bias out of the process. And sometimes we get quite a bit of pushback of people who've come out really well within the assessments, because the manager or the person that is running it was not expecting it.
So interesting. So this is someone who's kind of almost hidden potential. Maybe they didn't get along with their manager, or maybe their manager wasn't coaching them, or they were in maybe a role that didn't allow them to work fully to their strengths.
Absolutely. And that's what we call, so you've got hypos, and then you've got shypos.
Okay.
And so this is that hidden talent, or people who might be a little bit more under the radar that can come out through this process. And that's one reason why we always say, and when we think about who's going to actually go through the assessments, and have an open enrollment part of it, rather than have managers put people forward.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Open it up to anyone who is interested within.
So anyone who has a level of ambition essentially can put themselves forward, rather than the managers picking and choosing who they see are the high potentials, which brings back to subjectivity again
Yeah,
and bias. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
Because it is about finding those sort of hidden stars within the organization as well.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and saying, well, how do we then support and develop them
yeah,
to reach the potential that they've got
yeah,
um, within the organization? And yeah, that then naturally leads on to succession
yeah,
as well, because then you're saying, well, who is this pool of high potential um, that we've got, and then looking at, and succession slightly different because it's about business continuity, and do we have and are we developing the talent within our organization to then take on these roles that are critical to the organization. So it's not just about um, the top jobs.
yeah,
When we talk about succession planning, it's about thinking what roles are critical to an organization.
yeah, and being able to
And then,
define that as well. Yeah,
yeah, so there's a piece that we do around, well, understanding and doing critical role scoring around, what impact does this role have? What skills and other unique skills that are needed for this role as well, to define what roles should actually be within that succession process, and need a depth of talent. And we always call it the bench, right? The understanding the bench depth that you've got for each of these roles, and where you might be a little bit exposed, and thinking about, well, how can you develop and ensure that there is a deeper bench strength in these areas, and in these different departments as well.
do you mean that you have people who could potentially take on that role should
Yeah,
the person leave or something happen
yeah,
or whatever it might
yeah,
be, that you
exactly. So
have
I'm
sufficient
using,
number of people who could potentially step into that role
yeah,
with those
yeah, so
strengths? Yeah.
using a sort of and I'm using a sporting
Yeah, yeah,
analogy,
yeah. I
saying your
got that.
bench
Yeah,
strength.
yeah.
So if you I'm thinking about from a football team, right? So if your goalie gets injured, how many goalies do you have on the bench that can, or how many people do you have on the bench? They may not be in the goalie position right now, but could move to that position and perform and
Yeah.
be able to cover that spot,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so that you can keep playing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I have so many different questions, like, and I'm thinking, what's the first step that people need to take? But also, how do you do this? So I've come from global organizations, but being small in a small part of a global organization, how do you start to implement those kinds of changes in an organization that's global and should be doing this at a global level? But actually, how do you start implementing that locally as well?
Yeah, a very good question. Um, and so I think there is, yeah, and I'm not actually sure how to answer it. Um, so there's a whole process that you go with, but it starts by first identifying those roles within the organization, be it at a local level
Yeah.
or be it at a global level. Um, and then for a succession perspective, then it
Yeah.
would be nominating people. It would
Okay.
be who within the organization is within that sort of band that we think is a natural successor, um, and having, about a good, it wouldn't be just one person that you'd want to be going through that process because they are the natural successor, but what is the 4 or 5 or 6 people sitting underneath this role
Yeah. That could
that
step up, maybe.
that could step up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
um, and so you'd need to, the way that we do it is we meet with the person who's the incumbent, who's in that role, and understand what is the role, and
Yeah.
create what we call a success profile. So what is success in this role? And then that success profile is used to create an assessment of, to say, how do we measure the experience and also that we look at potential as well, experience and potential of this person to say they are, ready within a year, ready with 1 to 2 years. What development do they need to do?
Yeah.
I think again, it goes back down to really understanding for those people that are on the bench, as we like to say, what is it that they need to do to keep developing those skills so that they are ready up as and when the
That
opportunity.
they're ready to do that. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Marijke, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
The being happier at work, I think means to me being able to turn up to work and be able to be yourself, and be able to use those unique strengths that you have got every day.
Yeah.
Because that, for me, and I've been on both sides. So I've been in a role where I was not the right fit for that role.
Yeah.
Felt the grayness, and I'm now in a role that I'm using my strengths on a day-to-day basis, and it's full color HD.
Yeah. Love it. And if people want to reach out to you, if they want to know more about what Mercer Talent Enterprise does, what's the best way or what's the best place they can do that?
Yeah, I mean, we're of course all over LinkedIn. So please feel free to search for Mercer Talent Enterprise on LinkedIn. We also have, of course, our Mercer Talent Enterprise website. Or also feel free to reach out to me. On LinkedIn as well. I think those would be the best options, through our website, through LinkedIn.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. I think we probably could have gone down loads and loads of different avenues, but I so enjoyed this conversation, and I'm definitely thirsty for more and understanding about my own strengths and how to use that information. But I'm sure listeners are as well, that they're like, okay, what do I need to do next? How can I understand more about my own strengths? So thank you so much for your time today. Really, really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I love talking about it. So it's it's such an honor.